We're now on Daf Chaf Hei Amud Beis, and we're giving a list of Golmei Kli Mateches. For example, Lashuv, right? We said he's going to smoothen it down. L'Shabes, he's going to add studs to it. Probably studs of gold, Rashi says, that adorns the Kli. L'Gorer is to plane the Kli with a plane. L'Charker, to engrave the Kli. Again, this is all aesthetics. He adds designs to the Kli, but he's not satisfied with the Kli as it is. Mechusar Kain, and certainly if it's missing a stand, or Ogen, it's missing the rim around. They used to add a rim around the top of the Kli. Oh, Ozen, it doesn't have a handle. It's tar. The exact opposite of Kli Eitz. Mechusar Kisui Tame. A lid is a separate Kli unto itself. So even though the basic Kli, the metal utensil, needs a covering, but nevertheless, since the covering is a separate Kli, we could say that as far as the manufacture of the basic utensil, the pot itself, he has completed that manufacture. It's no longer Golmei, and therefore it's Makabel Tumah. So the Gemara asks, Maishna Hani Umaishna Hani. Right, we have in the case of Kli Eitz that if his intention is to add some sort of adornment to it, right, some sort of tsura to beautify it aesthetically, then it's makabel tumah even though it's golden. But in the case of metal utensils, if he hasn't added these studs or whatever it is to beautify the kli, then it's not makabel tumah. Rabbi Yochanan Omar hoil ulekaved asuyim. Rav Nachman Omar hoil udmeim yukar. So we have now a machlokes as to why, in the case of metal utensils, if he still intends, but he hasn't yet completed the kli, he intends to beautify it, then it's considered golden, even though it's only an adornment. And we have Rabbi Yochanan on one hand and Rav Nachman on the other hand. According to Rabbi Yochanan, hoil ulekavod asuyim. In other words, when they make a metal kli, apparently in those days, metal kalim was a ganze business, a very ostentatious kind of thing. Not everyone could afford these metal kalim. What they would do is they would ornament the kli, because, when somebody came into the house, like today we have these, what's the word I want to use? You know what I mean? These closets. What's the word I want to use? Where you put the silver and everything else. Whatever the word is. So you very much impress someone who comes into your house when he sees, and behind these glass closets, he's cages or whatever. He sees these beautiful silver, adornment things. So with the case of silver, it's lekavod asuyim. It's something that adds cover and prestige to the person who owns it, and therefore he wants to add the ornamentation. Rav Nachman, on the other hand, says demeim yikarim, meaning that since the market value of a metal kli is very high, it will be enhanced tremendously by adding ornaments to the kli, like, for example, studding the kli with designs. My binai, what's the nafkamina between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Nachman? Ikabeinayu kli etzem. So let's say you take the bone of an elephant, and an animal, and you make a kli out of it. That's a very expensive process. And in such a case, would the bone utensil that's expensive, would it be makabel tumah if he hasn't yet ornamented it? And the answer is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, since the requirement of ornamentation is for the sake of prestige, in the case of a bone utensil, there was no prestige that was enjoyed, benefit for the owner. But according to Nachman, he says, well, since bone utensils are very, very expensive, therefore you require ornamentation. And with the absence of ornamentation, it's golmei kli mateches, and it's not makabel tumah. The Azar of Nachman l'tamei Rav Nachman kli etzem Kikli matochos dami. So Rav Nachman explicitly goes on record as ruling that we have an equation between kliates, that's bone utensils, and kli matechas. And just like kli matechas, if you have it added and finished it up with the ornamentation, it's not makabel tum, it's golmim. So too with regard to kliates. Michlal the klietz, I'm sorry. Michlal the klietz makabli tuma. Now wait a minute, we're assuming that a utensil made out of an animal bone is makabel tuma. Where do we know that from? The Torah discusses kli matechos, kli eitz. What about a kli etza made of a bone of an animal? And the Gemara answers in, yes. The Torah says it. The Sanya, as we learned in the Brayso, Omer, Ma tamelom v'chol ma'aseh izim tischatou. So this pasuk is in Bamidbar Perek Lamed Aleph with regard to kol beged v'chol kli or v'chol maseh izim v'chol kli eitz tischatou. And tischatou means that you purify them from tumah. Lahavi davar abba min ha'izim. Now, what does that mean, davar abba min ha'izim? Are we talking about, the, 1 second. Are we talking about the hides of a goat? Or are we talking about the bones of a goat? Well, take a look at what it says over here. It says, min ha'karnayim, right? These are the horns. Min ha'tlofim, the hoofs. And therefore we're talking about the bones. And we see that Maaseh Izim needs purification. It's when they went to war against Midian. Now, if it needs purification, it means it's makabel tumah. And why is it makabel tumah if it's only made of a bone? The answer is that bones, if you use them to make utensils, are makabel tumah. But shar be'ev v'chai minolan, okay, fine. So in the case of a goat, you've derived the conclusion that the bones, call it the hooves or the horns of a goat are makabel tumah. How do you know that the horns and the what do you call it? The bones or hooves of any other animal on the makabel tumah? Tamilon v'chol maseh. That there's an extra word in the pasuk lechol maseh, right? V'chol maseh is coming to include all other animals, meaning all the bones of other animals that you use to make kelim and makabel tumah. In kemat tamalomer izim. Why did the Torah specify the goat? Prat la'ofos. So we have a ribui from the word v'chol maseh. We have a niyat from the word gidi, or I should say a's. And that's coming to exclude ophos. Also, the Mepharshim say also dugim. So let's say you have, a bone, so to speak, of a bird or of a fish. Yeah, I don't know. Oh, I guess maybe the scales of a fish, of larger fish, could be used to make a utensil out of them. I don't know. Got to go to to visit go see the different kinds of fish. So that would not be makabel tumah. Can you give me an example, by the way, of a fish that has a large kind of scale to it that you might want to take it off and use it as a cup or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, I can imagine a large fish with big scales. All right, now we're up to the next Mishnah. We'll have another one as well. And here we go from Tumah Vitara to Zroim, to Trumas and Masros. Okay. Hachayev b'shkedim hamorim poter b'mesukim Hachayev b'mesukim, potter b'morim. Okay, so there are two types of almonds. There's morim, which are the bitter almonds, and the larger they become as they grow on the almond tree, they become more and more bitter. Then you have the sweet almond, and the opposite takes place. As it grows and grows, it becomes sweeter and sweeter. So the question is, are you chayiv in trumos and maasros on almonds? And Tanu Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, shkedim amorim, when they are the bitter almonds, that category, which we said will will consider it non-edible because they're so bitter, is they get bitter and bitterer with time. So therefore, ketanim, when they're still, ripe, young on the tree, they're not so bitter, and you could eat them. But gedolim, when they mature and they grow to full capacity, then they're very bitter and they're no longer edible. You got to make sure you harvest it early. And then nafkamina is going to be pturim, that these large almonds, which are bitter almonds, and now they're large and they're very, very bitter, they're not considered an ochel. There's no chiyuv trumas and masros. But mesukim, with regard to a different category of almonds, which are the sweet almonds, then it's just the opposite. Why? Gdolim chayovin, because they become sweeter and sweeter with growth. But ketanim pturim, when they're very small, they're still quite bitter. They haven't yet sweetened. And therefore, nobody eats them at this early stage of development. However, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi Mishum Aviv, zeh v'zeh liftar. The Amri Lo, we have another tradition, zeh v'zeh l'chiyuv. So we're talking about both categories of almonds, according to Rabbi Yishmael, meaning both the bitter almonds and the sweet almonds. And according to the first tradition, the Lishna Kama, when even if they're bitter or sweet, it makes no difference. They are potur from maser. So whereas the Tanakama said that in the case of shkedim amorim, when they're ketanim in their early stage development, they're still sweet and therefore they're edible and they're chayiv in trumas and ma'aser. Rabbi Shmuel, on the other hand, would say that even though they're small, according to this lishna, the first lishna, they are potur, meaning that he held that even when the almonds are small, nevertheless they're still quite bitter, and nobody would normally eat them. But then we have the exact opposite in the Lishna Basra, and that claims that in all cases, you're chayev in maser. Now, all cases here, now we switch from the small almonds at the early stage to the larger almonds, and he's saying that even in the case of the bitter almonds, they're chayev in maser. Now let me just see if anybody adds anything here. He says, according to Lishna Basra, both types of bitter almonds are chayiv in maser. The larger ones, because they're fully mature. The smaller ones, because they are more edible. Omer Avila, Hora Rabbi Chanina b'tzipori kedivrei Omer zeh v'zeh liftar. So the final ruling was accepted like the first Lishna of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi that it doesn't matter whether they're small or large, they are exempt. But let's now analyze theoretically the other lishna. Now you're talking about bitter almonds. They get more and more bitter as they develop. And yet, according to the second lishna in Rabbi Shmuel, we're going to say that it's makabel tumah, but it's very, very bitter, and they're large bitter almonds. What are they? What are they suitable for? Rabbi Yochanan, hol v'yochel lematkan al yidei ha'or. You can put them over the fire and roast them, and they become sweet. Now we have the second Mishnah on our page, Chaf Heyom and Beis, about Temed. So let's try to understand what Temed is all about. Now, Temed is not your regular wine, but rather you take grape seeds or sediments of wine and you soak them in water. And at some point, it's going to ferment, and that's called temed. So the entire Mishnah that we're studying now is going to be focused on, just one second. Yeah, on whether or not this situation that we have right now, where the grape seeds or the sediments of wine are now soaking, when is the transition between mayim, its water, and yayin, and its wine? And the nafkamin is going to be a temed achlo hichmitz. If it hasn't yet fermented, then it's considered water. And therefore, eno nikach bekesef maser. So what's kesef maser? Right, I'm chayiv to be mafresh maser sheni on the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the Shemitah cycle, and then it's too much to bring it up to Yerushalayim, so I do a pidyon. And now I transfer the kedusha from the grains of Maser Sheni over to domim, over to liquid, to coins, and with those coins I go up to Yerushalayim and I purchase betara, food that has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. But I cannot purchase water. I can only purchase wine or any other foodstuff. And therefore, the Mishnah says that right now, since we're in the temed, pre-temed stage, meaning before fermentation, it's considered water, and you cannot use Maser Sheni money to buy water. Next, uposel es ha-mikvah. So we have a halacha that 3 lugim of mayim she'uvim, right, mayim that came through some sort of utensil, will pasel a mikvah, but only if it's mayim. And now we're saying that this temed, since it hasn't reached the stage of fermentation, it's still mayim, and therefore it's mayim shuvim if it comes into the mikvah through a utensil, and therefore pasels the mikvah. But mishehichmitz, once we reach the stage where these grape seeds soaking in water or the sediments are now fermented, at that point it becomes yayin. And therefore, nikaf bekesev maser, eno posel sam mikvah. So the psul of a mikvah is only mayim she'uvim, but not yayin. Okay, now the Mishnah goes on to discuss another kind of maser and a contrast within that, and that's called maser behem. So you have 10 behemos, and you send them through the corral. When the 10th one comes out, it's kadosh l'mizbeach, and it's called maser behem. Now, ha'achim ha'shutfim. So now we enter into a sugya which is called tfusas habayis, which means that after the death of the father, let's say, the Morish, but before they've actually divvied up the nachla, Reuven gets the south side, Shimon gets the north side, etc., etc. It's called Tfusas Habayis. Now, there's a halacha called a kalbon. The kalbon means that when you have to give a machzis shekel on an annual basis to the lishkas hagaz, to the trumas halishka, which can be used for karbanos tzibur, then you have to add on top of the machzis shekel an additional payment. Okay, we have to see how much that is, but that's called a kalbon. Now, in a case of a partnership, like for example, let's say you and I want to get together and we're going to offer a full shekel for the two of us, each one a half a shekel. In that case, you have to add a kalbon. So again, whatever the amount of the kalbon is, that's not for us now, but it's kind of like a surcharge, because the gizbar now has to break down the shekel into two machzas a shekel and so forth. So you have to sort of offer him something. However, that's only after the Yorshim have divided up the Nachla, the Yerusha. Then they are considered like Shutfim, and Shutfim have to pay a kalbon. But before they actually divvy it up, that's called Tfusas Habayis. And it's almost as if all of the properties are in the possession of the father, and it's a one-man show, and therefore there's no chiyuv kalbon. So that's what our Mishnah says. Achem Ashutfim, if they're chayav in kalbon, which means that right now it's before they divvied it up, it's a tfusas habayis situation, and therefore they have to pay the kalbon. Then the exact opposite is true with regard to maser behema, pturim mi maser behema. They don't have to pay, they don't have to be mafresh maser behema. But shechayovim b'maser behema, meaning once they, just 1 second. I'm sorry, I just got to want to get to, we're almost finished with the daf, but I just want to, how are we doing on the call? Oh, okay, we still have a few minutes. Ah, so what we have to know here is that shutfim are potter from maser behema. But before they divvied up the estate, then all the animals are in tfus sabayis, and they belong, so to speak, to the father, to the morish, even though technically he's gone already. So at what point are they potter from maser sheni? That's the point after they divvy up the Yerusha, the animals, and now they have a loch of shutfim, and shutfim are potim in a mas. On the other hand, paradoxically, shutfim are chayiv in kalbon when they come to be podis, so to speak, their matzah shekel. Let's see the Gemara. Mani masnisin lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbana. The Sanya hamesamed v'nosan mayim b'mida u'motza kedei midaso poter Rabbi Yehuda machayev. Okay, so we now have a machlokes. He says that this machlokes is a Mishnah, actually, even though it says Tanya, in the fifth parak of Trumos. I'm sorry, the fifth parak of Masos. So he poured water, a measured amount of water, onto the sediments of wine. Now he strains the sediments and he finds that he has exactly the same volume of water that he had when he poured it in. So the Tanakama says you're potur, you're not chayiv in maser, you're potur from maser, and Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv. Okay, so the Gemara is going to go through different explanations. Rabbi Yehuda assumes that the original water was now absorbed by the sediment, into the sediment, and what you get as a result is wine. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, say that since you end up with the same volume of liquid as the water when you put it in initially, then that liquid is just flavored water. It's not wine. And if it's water, then it's potuf in a maser. Says the Gemara, our Mishnah doesn't work out with anybody. Why? Rabbanon, if our Mishnah was authored by the Rabbanon, is afal gav the hichmitz. Why does that Mishnah say it depends upon hichmitz or low hichmitz? Because the Rabbanon would hold, even if it was hichmitz, the temet is still considered mayin. Meaning the Rabbanon don't make any difference, any distinction between hichmitz and low hichmitz. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, afagav the low hichmitz, meaning if it was soaking in the water, even though it hasn't yet fermented, temet is considered yayin. But our Mishnah says whether temet is yayin or mayim depends upon whether hichmitz or not. Neither the Rabbanan nor Rabbi Yehuda make the definition of temet depend upon whether hichmitz. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that temet itself, insofar as it's soaked and absorb the sediments, is yayin, and the Rabbanan hold that even if it was hichmitz, it wouldn't make any difference. It's mayin, because you end up with the same volume of water that you put in from the start. Rav Nachman, Omar Rav Bar Avua, here we turn to the Chavav, kishehichmitz, b'shehichmitz machlokes. Meaning you misunderstood Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda didn't say that temet is chayiv v'maser in all situations, even if you find the same volume of water as what you put in originally, and even if there was no hichmitz, but rather, Rabbi Yehuda holds that it becomes yayin and it gets the status of yayin only after hichmitz. Umasnisa Rabbi Yehuda. And our Mishnah, which says that whether temet is chayiv v'maser or not depends upon hichmitz, that reflects the shita Rabbi Yehuda. V'chein Omer Rabbi Yossi v'Rab Chanina, kishe hichmitz machlokes. Okay, the next piece is also part of our sugya, but it's a bit more complicated. It has to do with the status of the water that's soaking up the sediment before hichmitz, but we know it's going to be hichmitz. So that's going to be the sugya about whether or not we could already anticipate now as if it were hichmitz, even though it hasn't yet been hichmitz. And that requires a concept called lemafreya. You remember lemafreya, retroactivity, meaning that when it finally reaches the stage of fermentation, then I go back lemafreya to the time that he started making this this solution called temed, and it's already considered yain from that point lemafreya. Okay, then so that's going to be the next part of the sugya, which in Mitzvah Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow. Thank you so much, and Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov.